You took me into your home, even as a wounded, ugly slave. Now let me warm your bed forever, human. Hurry on. 3 made no sound. There was no air to carry it. Only dust, fine, abrasive, the color of dried blood, covering the surface like a memory no one dared disturb. The vacuum outside Galen's dome pressed in with an ancient stillness, like even time had been forgotten here. Inside his suit, the hum of oxygen and the steady click of his boot seals felt louder than they should. Familiar, routine. This was how his days passed now. Quiet repairs, silent walks, the cold solace of the archive towers. Until today, it was the trail that broke the rhythm. A faint disruption in the powder. Not from wind, there was no wind, but something heavier than dust. Drag marks. Uneven. A stumble, then crawl. Then nothing. He followed them without thinking. A few meters ahead, nestled in the shadow of a deactivated relay pylon, lay a figure curled into itself. Motionless. Blue. At first, he thought it was a synthetic, an old retrieval drone half-buried and power-dead. Then he saw the uneven rise and fall of its chest, the fingers half-closed around a scrap of fabric, and the filthy, matted spill of long white hair fanned out against the red earth. Human-sized, not human. He dropped to one knee, careful not to stir the dust too much, and reached for her shoulder. She flinched at the touch. Not a spasm of pain, something deeper. A memory. She didn't cry out. She didn't move again. Her face, when he saw it beneath the cracked faceplate, was gaunt and mud-streaked. Dried blood and grime clung to the delicate blue skin stretched over her cheekbones. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. Then she whispered, "Don't sell me." The voice scraped the silence raw. He froze. Every breath he'd ever taken in the name of neutrality, every oath he'd made to preserve memory without interference, turned to ash in that instant. The whisper was not fear. It was surrender. Not to him, to history. "I won't," he said, though she'd already drifted into stillness again. His fingers hovered at her collar. Tucked beneath the filthy neckline of her suit was a chain, silver, blackened by time. At its end hung a small hexagonal charm, etched in a curling script he didn't recognize. It was smeared with blood and cracked across the center. She'd kept it close. He unlatched her helmet and lifted her with practiced care. Her body was too light. Not starving, but close. Her right foot dragged. The boot there had split at the seam. Her hair, once long and probably beautiful, was tangled and stiff with old dirt. Scratches ran up her arms, some shallow, some deeper. Nothing fresh, just neglected. She made no sound as he carried her back to the dome. Inside the lock, the seal hissed, pressure equalized, and the red dust blew from his boots as he stepped through. The silence shifted. He laid her gently across the padded bench of the decontamination chamber, flicking the ambient heat to maximum. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, watching her chest rise and fall. It had been 22 years since he'd last touched a Jalari. And even then, it hadn't been his hands, only his eyes, watching through a feed. It was a different camp, different dust. A woman clutching a child, not her own. "Please," she'd mouthed toward the hidden camera before the guards dragged her out of frame. Galen had filed the footage, marked it for high security, and done nothing else. The memory flared like acid behind his eyes. He bent to strip away the outer layers of her suit. She stirred slightly, but didn't fight. The material flaked in places. He used scissors for the worst of it, exposing a body not broken, but weathered. Her skin bore the pockmarks of prolonged exposure, grit burns along her side, a deeper gouge under her ribs, half-healed. He sprayed antiseptic, pausing each time her body tensed. "I know," he murmured when she sucked in breath. "It stings." He didn't linger. Wrapped in a fresh thermal blanket, she looked somehow smaller, less alien, more human than any photo he'd ever seen in the reports. She still held the piece of cloth, tattered, grayish blue, the corner embroidered with faded thread. Maybe it was a child's sleeve once. Maybe it wasn't. She didn't let it go. He brought a bowl of rehydrated protein broth to her side and set it down. For a long time, she didn't move. He took a spoonful himself, slowly, and set the spoon back down. Her eyes followed the movement. Her hand, dirty and shaking, reached for the bowl. She lifted it carefully, brought it to her lips, and drank. Too fast. She choked. He stepped forward to steady her, one hand rising instinctively. She jerked back, not violently, just enough to signal not yet. He stopped, waited. After a few tense seconds, she took another sip, slower this time. The tears came next. Quiet. No sobbing. Just a silent leak from eyes that hadn't shut in hours. Or maybe days. When she finished, she cradled the bowl in her lap and stared at the far wall like she'd forgotten what walls were for. Galen cleared the spare cot beside the decontamination bench and laid out a second blanket. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, voice low. She didn't answer. Her gaze tracked his every move, but gave nothing back. He dimmed the lights until only the soft blue of the emergency glows remained. Then he knelt, took the used bowl, and set it gently aside. When he looked back, her eyes were still open. Watching. "I won't leave the room," he said. That changed something. She didn't smile, didn't nod, but she adjusted the blanket with a careful motion, pulling it higher across her shoulders. A breath eased from her chest. Not full relaxation, not trust, but the first inch of it. That was enough. He sat against the opposite wall, arms folded, head bowed. It wasn't sleep that came over him. Not yet. Just stillness. A quieter kind of waking. Across from him, under layers of thermal fabric and the glow of salvaged light, a woman who had no name yet lay breathing. Not file ID #4439JH. Not the girl with the barcode wrist. Not the cut voice in the audio feed. She was real. And for the first time in his life, Glenn didn't document her. He protected her. Not because the law allowed it. Not because it made sense. But because somewhere long ago, this too should have been archived. Not as a crime, but as a beginning. And he wasn't going to let her vanish in his silence again. Not this time. Not ever. When Glenn woke, the dome's low lighting cast long shadows across the floor, the kind that made silence feel heavier than it should. The air had warmed during the night, settling into that artificial comfort only an archivist's dome could maintain. Outside, beyond the curved wall of metal and glass, Perion 3 remained frozen and untouched, just as it always was. But something had changed inside. He turned his head slowly, unsure what he'd find. The woman hadn't moved much. She still lay beneath the thermal blanket on the cot, her long white hair now fanned cleanly across the pillow he'd tucked beneath her head. At some point during the night, she had shifted just slightly, turning toward him in sleep. Not curled in on herself anymore, but resting on her side, her hand close to her chest, fingers still clutching that faded scrap of cloth. It was a small detail, but it felt enormous. He sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his back. His muscles protested the floor's unyielding surface, but he didn't mind. He'd kept his word. He hadn't left her. Rising quietly, Glenn crossed the room to the kitchenette unit. The hum of the heater coil and the smell of brewing synth tea filled the space. He placed a kettle on the warmer, then turned back, pausing when he realized she was awake. Her eyes were open, watching him, unblinking. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But she didn't flinch this time. That, in itself, was enough to make him pause. He took a slow breath and turned back to the tea. "I'm making something warm," he said quietly. "You don't have to take it. Just, it's here if you want it." Her expression didn't shift. Not yet. But he could see something behind her gaze. Not fear. Not even mistrust. Just distance. That practiced emotional disconnection he'd seen in too many of the archived testimonies. Not silence by choice, silence by conditioning. He prepared 2 cups, set them down on the table, and walked away. After several minutes, he heard movement, a hesitant rustle of blankets, then the soft shuffle of bare feet on tile. She didn't sit at the table. Instead, she stood a few paces away, eyes on the tea like it might burn her. "It's safe," he said. No reaction. "I tasted it already, if that helps." Still nothing. But slowly, painfully slowly, she stepped forward and sat. Her fingers didn't reach for the cup right away. She stared at the steam, breathing it in as if even that scent felt dangerous. Then, almost imperceptibly, her hand moved. She lifted the cup, brought it to her lips, and drank. Glenn let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She only took 2 sips before setting the cup down again. But her eyes lifted to meet his for the first time since he'd found her. There was something in that glance, unspoken but unmistakable. A question, maybe even the start of trust. "I don't know your name," he said gently, "and I won't ask. Not yet. Not until you want me to know it." A pause. Then her voice, faint, hoarse from disuse, broke the quiet. "You didn't scan me." He nodded. "No." "You didn't call it in." "No." "Why?" He hesitated. The answer came too quickly, too raw. "Because last time I watched a Jalari woman disappear from a screen, I couldn't stop it. I documented it. Recorded every second. Labeled a file. That was all I did." She tilted her head slightly, a small crease forming between her brows. Was she me? No, but she might as well have been. The silence between them thickened, not in hostility, but in something heavier. Shared recognition. She turned her gaze back to the table, hands curling around the tea as if warming them was more important than drinking. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You're alone here." He nodded. "Retired. Voluntary exile, I guess. This outpost isn't exactly in demand." "Why?" "Because I spent too many years telling the truth about things no one wanted to remember. They didn't want to silence me, just bury me. So I let them." She studied him again, this time with sharper attention. "And now I clean corrupted records and restore broken files. I tend the dead voices." Her fingers traced the rim of the cup. "You don't ask questions. I learned to stop." "Then why did you help me?" The question sat between them for a long moment. Glenn looked down at his own hands. They were shaking slightly. Maybe from cold. Maybe not. "Because I saw someone dying," he said at last. "And I couldn't archive that." She didn't respond. But this time, she didn't look away. That night, he gave her his bed. He set out fresh clothes, simple thermal layers, and waited in the hall while she changed. When she finally stepped out, wrapped in soft gray fabric too large for her frame, she didn't avoid his eyes. Her posture was still guarded, but there was a new weight to the way she stood. A choice. He guided her back to the cot and draped a new blanket over her shoulders. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, but when he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "I don't want to sleep alone." He froze. She added more quietly, "Just stay in the room." He nodded. "Of course." He unrolled his mat again and lay down. She lay down too, this time without curling in on herself. In the low light, Glenn saw her open her hand. The cloth was still there, folded carefully, guarded like a talisman. He didn't ask. He just watched as her fingers closed over it once more. And for the first time, her breathing slowed into something like peace. Sleep came slower for him, but when it did, it came with a thought. Whatever she'd lost, whatever had been taken, she was still here. And as long as she stayed in this dome, no one else would take anything from her again. The third morning came with a brittle silence. Outside, the dust curled in windless spirals beneath a slate-colored sky. Purion, 3 didn't host weather in the usual sense, but the pressure drop could be felt in the way the dome creaked, like old bones resisting movement. Glenn rose early, slipping from the mat without waking her. Sairi slept curled on the cot, her arms folded tightly around her chest. Her breath was shallow, the blanket only half pulled over her body. Even in sleep, her posture was defensive. He let her be. In the kitchenette, Glenn moved through practiced motions, tea, nutrient paste, a small ration of reheated flatbread. He kept the temperature slightly elevated. The dome's auto-climate defaulted to efficient unless manually adjusted, which often meant cold fingers and colder floors. He preferred warmth. So did she, though she hadn't said as much. By the time the aroma of tea drifted into the sleeping chamber, Sairi had woken. She stood at the doorway, silent, barefoot on the heated tile. Her long white hair hung in tangled curtains around her face, still dull with dried oil and dust. A line of reddish grime marked the edge of her collarbone, where the cleaning cloth hadn't reached. Her skin, Where visible was a patchwork of healing abrasions, faint scratches along her forearms, a blister just below her wrist. Not fresh, but untreated. Her eyes met his briefly, then dropped. Glenn set down the mug he'd prepared and crossed the room, giving her space. He didn't speak until he'd opened the panel to the hygiene chamber. "The shower's manual," he said. "You can lock the door from the inside. There are no cams. Nothing records in that room." Her shoulders rose, almost imperceptibly, like a breath caught and held. He continued, voice steady. "You'll find clean clothes on the bench. Soft fibers, no tags. The water stays warm for up to 12 minutes before the recycler needs to cycle. You can take as long as you need." Still, she didn't move. Glenn stepped back, keeping his hands visible. "You don't have to, but I thought it might feel good." Another pause. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. She passed him without a word, brushing against his arm as she moved. Not deliberately, just enough to leave a ghost of contact that stayed long after she closed the hygiene door behind her. He didn't listen. He busied himself cleaning dishes that didn't need it, aligning already aligned tools. The dome was quiet, too quiet. No humming machines, no playback of archived testimonies. Just the faint sound of running water, a sound he hadn't heard in that room for years. 12 minutes passed, then 15. He was about to check the system status when the door opened. Sairi emerged slowly. Her hair, now damp, had been combed through with fingers. The grime was gone. The purple bruising across her clavicle had faded to mottled gray-blue. The slave brand was still visible, faint but unmistakable, just above her left shoulder blade. She wore the soft gray thermals he'd set out, slightly too large, loose around her wrists. But her posture had changed. She stood taller, less coiled inward. Her eyes lifted and met his fully. She looked new, not healed, not untouched, but unburdened. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and offered the tea. She took it in both hands, sipping carefully. And then, without prompting, she said, "I thought I'd forgotten what warm water felt like." Her voice had depth now, not strength, something more fragile. Presence. "It helps," he replied, simply. She moved to the table and sat. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a piece of flatbread. When she bit into it, something shifted in her face, an involuntary softness, like muscle memory long and used. "I try to wash the memory off," she said after a moment. "But it's still here, under the skin." Glenn sat opposite her. "Then it's not just a memory. It's survival." She looked up sharply, but didn't correct him. "I kept something," she said, "in the camps. When they moved us, they let us keep one personal item. Mine was just a piece of fabric torn from my mother's shawl." Her fingers moved unconsciously to her side, where a hidden seam had been resewn. "I stitched it into my underlayer. I think it saved me." He didn't ask to see it. He didn't need to. She looked at him across the table. "You watched things, didn't you? Things like what happened to us." He nodded once. "And you couldn't intervene." "I wasn't supposed to," he said. "But I didn't try either." There was no accusation in her voice, only observation. "And now I think the record matters less than the person standing in front of me." That made her pause. Something in her face softened. "You don't touch me without permission. Not even when I'm falling apart." "You're not falling apart." Her voice dipped to almost a whisper. "Not anymore." She finished her tea, hands wrapped tight around the cup for warmth. He watched her without staring, letting her have the silence. That evening, she stood in the sleeping chamber, looking at the mat on the floor where he'd slept every night since she arrived. "You don't have to stay on the ground," she said quietly. "I said I wouldn't till you were ready. I'm not asking you to touch me," she added, voice steady. "Just don't sleep so far." He nodded. When he lay down beside her later, on the cot rather than the floor, she didn't face away. She didn't curl into herself. She lay still, watching him. He kept his hands to himself. But when she reached across the small space between them and placed her fingers against his chest, he didn't move away. "I used to be afraid of sleep," she whispered. "Now I only fear waking." "You're safe here." "Safe," she echoed. "That's what this feels like." Her eyes closed. She slept deeply that night, her hand never leaving his chest. Glenn didn't sleep for a long time, but when he finally did, he dreamed of water, clean and warm and endlessly flowing, and of a woman wrapped in gray fabric who no longer had to carry silence like armor. It was just before dawn when Sairi walked barefoot into the archive chamber, the faint heat from the floor tiles rising to meet her soles. She hadn't asked for permission. Glenn hadn't needed to give it. The door was always open now. The chamber felt different in the low light, less like a tomb of forgotten horrors and more like a place where something might begin again. Still, the air was heavy, thick with the quiet hum of machinery, blinking data cubes lining the walls like quiet witnesses. She stopped in front of a viewing console and let her fingers hover over the controls. Behind her, Glenn stood in the doorway, watching without interrupting. He carried two mugs, tea, strong and bitter, just the way she liked it now. She accepted hers without a word. Then she turned toward the screen and activated a file. A woman's voice began to speak. Not hers. Not yet. The recording was old, grainy, barely repaired. A Jalari woman, barely out of adolescence, sat under harsh white lights. Her eyes were swollen. Her hands trembled. She spoke in broken common tongue, cataloging what had been done to her. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. A moment later, the audio cut off entirely. Glenn reached forward and paused the playback. "That's one of the ones I logged myself," he said quietly. The original tape was scrubbed. We had to reconstruct her voice from sub-layer echoes. "Did she survive?" "No." Sairi nodded, eyes still on the screen. "That wasn't my camp," she said. "But it could have been. You don't have to keep watching these." "I do," she replied, "because no one else ever will." She set the mug down and walked past the rows of flickering cubes until she reached the corner terminal. That one she remembered. She'd seen it days ago when she first wandered the dome, but hadn't been ready to touch it. Now she was. "Can I show you something?" she asked, not turning to face him. "Yes." She entered a password, a sequence so precise, so smooth, it couldn't have been guessed. Not random. Remembered. Stored somewhere beyond survival. The console unlocked, revealing a single image file. Frozen. No sound. No movement. In the still frame, 5 women stood in the shadows of a collapsed mine shaft. All of them blue-skinned. All of them barefoot. In the center, one girl held a child, barely more than a baby, whose skin had already faded to gray from cold. The woman to her left, barely visible, had a long white braid and a cracked metal tag around her neck. "That's me," Sairi said. Glenn's breath caught. "I was 16. We were being transferred when the transport crashed. The others died from the cold or the wounds. I wasn't supposed to survive either. But one of the guards left me a heating module. I don't think he meant to be kind. I think he just forgot." She tapped the corner of the screen. "I kept this. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I wanted proof that I didn't imagine it. That I didn't make it up." "You didn't," Glenn said. "I believe you." She turned to him then, fully, and her voice softened. "You know what it's like, don't you? Not the pain. The guilt." He nodded slowly. "I watched whole colonies burn from satellite feeds. I archived their last transmissions. I sat in a padded room while a mother screamed into a corrupted channel, begging someone to tell her if her son was alive. I wrote her name into a report. I stamped it as incomplete due to data loss. Then I walked away." Sairi took a step closer. "I thought humans didn't feel shame," she said. "That it was beneath you, or above you. I don't know which." "We do," Glenn replied. "Some of us just hide it under badges and paperwork." She reached up and touched the edge of the cracked identification tag, still hanging around her neck, half buried beneath her tunic. He hadn't seen it clearly before now. It was fused to a piece of scrap metal, engraved in an old dialect, property of Kantar Extraction Services. "Is that why you left?" she asked. "Why you came here?" He sat down on the low bench by the console, setting his tea aside. "No, I left because I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces I didn't save. I stopped believing the archive was about justice. It became a graveyard, but I couldn't stop watching. So I came here, where no one would expect anything of me, where I could watch the dead without having to explain why." Sairi knelt beside him. I don't think I want revenge, she said. I thought I did. But now, I think I just want to be remembered as more than a file. You already are, he said. You're not an entry in a system. You're here, alive, choosing. Her eyes searched his face. And you? What do you want now? He hesitated, then answered with careful truth. I want to be the kind of man who would have helped you back then. You are, she said softly. Now you are. They sat in silence. Not heavy this time, not broken. When she stood, she reached out, not quickly, not dramatically, and took his hand. Her palm was cool but steady. He didn't pull away. Later that night, they didn't sleep side by side, but they slept closer than before. Her mat was only a hand's width from his, and when the dome's lights dimmed, she whispered his name. He answered without needing to speak. Neither of them had fixed what was broken in their past. But now, at least, they had started telling the truth about it. And sometimes, truth was the first step towards something like healing. The weather alarm chimed just after midday, low, steady, and unmistakable. Glenn looked up from the hydroponics console, reading the pressure drop with trained indifference. Another storm. It was expected on Parion, 3 this time of cycle, but the readings suggested something stronger. Magnetic frost front, possibly sweeping in from the crater belt. He keyed the broadcast. Storms inbound, he called out, loud enough to carry through the corridor. Sairi stepped into view a moment later. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, exposing the faint scar under her left jaw, one he hadn't seen clearly until now. Her expression wasn't anxious, just alert. Is it dangerous? She asked. Glenn shook his head, already moving toward the equipment locker. Not critical, but we'll lose solar. Temperature might drop fast. I'll need to lock the outer vents and reroute thermal flow from the archive wing. He paused, half expecting her to return to the bunk, or simply nod. Instead, she pulled on the outer coat hanging from the wall hook, his spare, oversized on her frame, and zipped it to her throat. I'll check the base seals near the generator. He blinked. You don't have to. I know. She was already turning. He didn't stop her. By the time the front hit, they were back inside, sweaty, smudged, and breathing hard from the exertion. The dome groaned slightly under the pressure change. Frost hissed against the outer wall like static on an old transmission line. Inside, the air cooled by 3 degrees in 20 minutes. They sat together on the floor near the thermal regulator, backs pressed to the low-maintenance panel, too tired to speak at first. Glenn wiped his forehead with a rag and tossed it aside. I used to panic during storms like this, Sairi said after a while, her voice flat but not hollow. The sound reminded me of containment sirens. Glenn didn't reply, just watched her from the corner of his eye. She closed her eyes briefly, then continued. But this doesn't feel the same. Why not? Because I know I can leave, that I won't be forced out or kept in. Her words sat heavy in the room. Glenn leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. I think I stopped noticing the difference. I've been here long enough that I forgot what doors are for. That's the problem with cages, she murmured. Eventually you stop needing locks. They fell into silence again. But this time it wasn't cold. It was full, dense with something unsaid. When Sairi finally moved, it was deliberate. She turned toward him, knees folded beneath her, and met his gaze directly. You always sit so still, she said, even when you're hurting. Glenn gave a tired smile. Comes with the job. You don't have to do that with me. He studied her face. She looked different now. Not just cleaner or stronger, but grounded like someone who had walked through fire and learned to breathe smoke. Then she reached forward and touched his cheek, wiping away a streak of grease with her thumb. Her fingers lingered, not out of hesitation, but choice. I see you, she said. Not the archivist. Not the bystander. Just you. Glenn swallowed hard. I started helping you because I needed to feel like I could still do something good. But that's not why I'm still here. Why are you still here? Because I care about you. Her eyes didn't soften. They sharpened, like her entire being focused in on him. You took me in, she said, voice steady. You saw me when I was dirt-covered, half dead. You didn't flinch. You didn't try to fix me or label me. She stood slowly, stepping in close, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath, even in the cool room. You took me home in my ugly state, she whispered. Now let me warm your bed forever. The words weren't seductive. They weren't rehearsed. They were raw, an offering made without fear, without apology. The culmination of trust that had grown from shared silences, nights spent listening to memory files, and mornings waking under the same roof without speaking. Glenn stood, but made no move to touch her. He didn't want to break the gravity of what she'd just said. You don't have to give me anything, he said. I'm not giving, she replied. I'm choosing. The lights flickered once, a reminder that outside, the storm still roared. But inside, the dome was steady, and so was she. He reached out and took her hand. She didn't hesitate. That night, there was no ceremony, no urgency. Sairi stepped out of her coat and climbed into his narrow bed as though it had always belonged to her. Glenn followed, slow and deliberate, laying beside her without speaking. Her body curled into his with gentle familiarity, and his arms came around her like they already knew the shape of her grief. For a long moment, neither moved. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with the weight of everything they hadn't said, everything that had lived in their glances and small kindnesses. The quiet hum of the storm outside faded into the background. Time slowed to the pace of breath. Glenn wasn't sure who moved first. It didn't matter. She was there, warm, real, deliberate. Sairi shifted, slowly, carefully. Her fingers slid across his chest, not exploring, just anchoring. Her breath warmed the hollow of his throat. She lifted her head, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked at him not through caution, not through fear, but desire. Want? Quiet and certain. He held her gaze. Are you sure? A faint smile touched the corners of her mouth. Not girlish, not flirtatious. Ancient. Earned. I've never been more sure of anything. Her hand found his, interlacing their fingers, and she guided it to the center of her chest. Not forcefully, not asking for permission, giving it. Glenn's breath hitched. The moment stretched, slow, grounding. He memorized every detail. The steady pressure of her palm over his, the rising heat where their skin met, the way her white hair spilled over his shoulder and clung to his arm like silver thread. Then, without a word, she moved. Sairi swung her leg over his hips and settled astride him. Not urgently, not to claim, but to meet him there. Fully, freely. Her weight grounded him. Her hips pressed into his, and she looked down at him with eyes so clear, so fiercely present, that it made his heart stutter. He had never seen anyone look like that. Not at him. Not with that kind of knowing. He opened his mouth to speak, but she leaned down and pressed her lips to his, soft, reverent, with no hurry. Her hands braced on either side of his chest, and the kiss deepened as naturally as a breath drawn in sleep. He responded, not with instinct, but intention, answering the rhythm she set, following the path she carved with her body. Sairi rocked gently, and a quiet sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half sigh. Not pain, not hesitation. Pleasure, real and unhidden. Her hips moved again, this time with more certainty, and Glenn's fingers tightened around her thighs. His voice came in a whisper, low and trembling. I've never. I know, she murmured, nuzzling against his jaw. Neither have I. Not like this. He felt her fingers at his shoulders, then in his hair, then at the side of his face. Every touch was slow, exploratory, filled with unspoken wonder. She wasn't rushing. She was remembering, reclaiming. Glenn felt his chest tighten, not from fear or desire alone, but from the weight of being seen, of being chosen. And she was choosing him, not because he was strong, not because he'd saved her, because he was here. Sairi's movements became more fluid, her body attuning to his, learning him. Her breath hitched again, and this time it came with a sound, soft, aching, helpless. Her head tipped back, silver hair cascading over her bare shoulders, and she gasped as his hands traced the curve of her spine. She leaned forward again, resting her forehead against his, her breathing uneven. Don't stop. I won't, he whispered. Not now. Not ever. The rhythm they found was slow, almost reverent. Two people who had never been allowed softness learning the shape of it together. She clung to him, not out of desperation, but joy. Pure, tremulous joy. Her nails dug in his back, not to hurt, but to hold. Her voice rose in soft cries, pleasure unraveling her in waves she didn't try to silence. He matched her, meeting each shift with care, each movement with awe. Her body trembled around him, not in fear but release. A full body surrender. Not to him, to herself. And when she fell against his chest, breathless and glowing with something far more than heat, he held her like she was made of starlight and memory. Fragile, enduring, eternal. They lay there for a long time, entangled, skin to skin, her head on his shoulder, his hands stroking her back in lazy, grateful patterns. No words passed between them for several minutes. Then she spoke, quiet but unshakably sure. "You took me home in my ugly state," she whispered, voice thick with tears she didn't shed. "Now let me warm your bed forever." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "You already do." Outside, the storm continued. But in the quiet heart of the dome, the only sound was the rhythm of shared breath and the gentle thrum of something new beginning. Morning came without sound. The storm had passed in the night, leaving a frost line like breath held against the outer dome, crystalline and silver. Inside, the warmth remained, a fragile, shared heat that lingered not just in the air, but in the space between two bodies that had finally found stillness in each other. Glenn woke first. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Cyree lay curled beside him, hair spread across his chest like fallen moonlight. Her breath was slow and even, one arm draped over his stomach, one leg tangled in his. She looked peaceful, unburdened. He didn't want to disturb her. So he stayed there, grounded beneath the quiet weight of her trust, breathing it in like oxygen he hadn't known he needed. This, he realized, was the first time in years he hadn't woken to silence as punishment. It felt like something new, something fragile, something real. She stirred a few minutes later, shifting slightly, then looking up at him with still sleepy eyes. "You watch me sleep," she said. He smiled. "Couldn't help it. You look different in the morning." "So do you." She leaned forward and kissed him, slowly, deliberately, then rested her forehead against his. "Last night wasn't just warmth," she said. "I know. Don't forget it." "I won't." They shared breakfast close together, sitting on the edge of the narrow cot with their knees touching. Cyree ate more than usual, quiet, focused. She didn't speak much, but her glances toward him were full of something unspoken. Assurance, perhaps, or the tentative beginnings of peace. Afterward, she went to the hydroponic bay to tend the moss beds, humming faintly to herself. Glenn returned to his station to finish restoring a half-corrupted voice file from a border skirmish 2 decades old. Everything was still, until the outer motion sensor blinked. A soft chime, easily missed, one he hadn't heard in over 4 years. Glenn stood slowly, staring at the blinking light above the airlock chamber. No one visited Purion 3, not unless they had reason. He keyed the console. A single vessel hovered outside the perimeter, sleek, white-banded, marked with the insignia of IICE, Interstellar Investigative Survey. Bureaucrats, lawkeepers, or worse. His heart sank. He turned to find Cyree already at the door. Her expression had gone stone still, eyes sharp. No panic but awareness. "They found me," she said, voice low and level. Glenn didn't answer. He stepped toward the console, fingers moving faster now. "No active warrant," he murmured, reading the feed. "But they've scanned the dome. They picked up an undocumented biosign." Cyree's jaw clenched. "Me. They don't know your name," Glenn said. "Not yet, but they'll ask." She didn't flinch. "Then let them." Glenn turned sharply. "If they classify you as missing property, they could legally requisition you, even if the company who owned the camp is gone. Those files were never purged." "I know." Her voice was calm, but not cold. "That's why I need to speak." He stared at her. "Cyree, I want in the archive. My voice. My memory. Not just scars they can scan and file. Me. I want to be heard, not erased again. Glenn hesitated, then nodded. Follow me. They walked to the main archive chamber in silence. He activated the oral testimony feed. She stepped forward, unshaking. The terminal beeped once. Recording began. My name is Sairi. Her voice didn't tremble. I was born on Vashtari 4. I was taken at 17 during a raid, disguised as a diplomatic inspection. I was branded, reassigned, sold, recycled. Each word came out clean and brutal, like blade strokes. I was called many things. Breeder, compliant, numbered. But I survived. I remember their names, their ranks, their brands. She paused. Then her eyes flicked to Glenn, standing behind the console. I was found by a man who didn't ask me to prove anything. He gave me heat, shelter, choice. Her voice softened. And now I give mine. She stepped back. The recording sealed itself into the dome's archival system. Immutable. Legal. Glenn exhaled slowly. Once that's indexed, it can't be wiped. Even by order. Good, she said. Now let them come. The knock came less than an hour later. 3 figures entered, white suits glinting under the dome lights. They didn't speak right away. Just scanned the room, eyes moving to Sairi with quiet precision. Unregistered Jalari biosignature, said the lead officer. A middle-aged woman with clipped vowels and no patience. We're required to log undocumented survivors under Enforcement Directive 27A. Hand her over for processing. She's not undocumented, Glenn said. She's not in system. She is now, he countered. Her testimony was uploaded 38 minutes ago into a Category Z War Crimes Index. Wiping it would be archive sabotage. The officer paused. She's listed as non-citizen property. Not anymore, Glenn said. Now she's a witness. Sairi stepped forward. You could try to take me, she said calmly. But you'll need to explain to your superiors why you silenced a survivor's lawful testimony. The woman hesitated. For just a moment, the illusion of control slipped. We'll file a dispute, she said stiffly. You do that, Glenn replied. The officers left without another word. Only after the airlock resealed did Glenn let his shoulders drop. Sairi was already walking toward him. That was bold, he said. That was necessary, she replied. He looked at her. Really looked. She stood tall, unflinching, branded neck bared with defiance instead of shame. You're not a file anymore, he whispered. She smiled. No, I'm not. That night, they lay together again, but it felt different now. Not like shelter, not like comfort, but like belonging. And no one would take that from them. Not ever again. The dome was quiet again. Not the hollow, sterile silence of archival solitude, but the kind born from steady breath, shared routines, and the rhythm of 2 lives slowly beginning to weave into one. 2 weeks had passed since the inspectors had left. They hadn't returned. Glenn no longer checked the perimeter scans every morning. Sairi no longer watched the door like it might open without warning. Whatever might come next, it wouldn't find them unprepared. Not anymore. But even in this calm, something had shifted. Sairi had grown quieter than usual, though not distant. She still reached for him when they crossed paths in the kitchen. Still slept with her head resting in the crook of his arm. But there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when she paused in her work and placed a hand on her abdomen, as if grounding herself. She'd gone pale more often, lost her appetite. Her hands, normally so steady when pruning moss or splicing wires, had begun to tremble without warning. Glenn noticed it all, but didn't press her. Not until the morning she woke up before sunrise and sat at the edge of the bed, her hair loose and glowing silver blue in the low dome light. I need to tell you something, she said. He sat up slowly. Okay. She didn't look afraid, just bracing herself. I'm late. Glenn blinked, not quite understanding. Late for my cycle, she said quietly. For rotations late. Silence hung in the room like vapor on cold glass. He processed slowly. Is that normal for your kind? A delay like that? She shook her head. No, and I've been nauseous every morning since last week. Smells make me dizzy. My skin's hypersensitive. I can smell the hydroponic yeast from the far, into the dome. Glenn exhaled. Have you been pregnant before? No, she said, voice almost a whisper now. But I remember what the others said. In the camps. They said once it starts, there's something different. Something pulling from the inside out. Something that's not just yours anymore. She turned her face away from him, like she didn't want him to see her expression. But he leaned forward, gently touching her shoulder. And now, he asked. I think I'm carrying a child, she said. Ours. The words fell between them, heavy but not crushing. Glenn didn't move, didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his cheek against the curve of her spine. And how do you feel about that? He asked softly. Her voice broke just once. Terrified. And something else I never thought I'd feel again. What's that? She turned slowly, her hands resting over his. Hope. They stayed like that a long time, sitting together, her body against his, the weight of something new and fragile blooming between them. That day, she didn't work the moss beds. She didn't file reports or read transcripts. Instead, she walked barefoot through the dome, hands resting against her belly, as if to remind herself she hadn't imagined it. Her steps were slower, her gaze distant. Glenn, ever practical, began researching quietly, accessing dormant med modules, checking viability rates, scouring through ancient biological compatibility studies. Most of what he found was outdated or speculative, but enough had been recorded from post-war Jalari reproductive analysis to confirm what she already knew. Rare, unlikely, but not impossible. And if it had happened, if their child was already growing, then she would be the first known cross-species survivor of a legacy designed to erase her. That night, she stood at the edge of the sleeping quarters, her silhouette framed in the soft amber glow of the dome's passive lighting. Glenn looked up from his chair as she entered, something in her posture already different. Not heavier, just fuller somehow, like the idea of life inside her had given her a kind of quiet expansion. She climbed into bed beside him and laid her head on his chest. I didn't think I'd want this, she murmured. I didn't think I deserved this, he answered. She traced a line along his arm, down to his hand. What if the child doesn't survive this moon? This place isn't built for beginnings. It is now, he said. If it wasn't, you never would have made it here. Her eyes met his, fierce and glass bright. I want them to have a name that isn't tied to pain. Then we'll give them one, he said. She smiled, small but real. Promise me one thing, she whispered. Anything. If I don't survive this, if something happens. Don't, he said, firm but gentle. We're not alone anymore, Siri. We don't speak in endings. She nodded, tears rising but unfallen. They lay together, her hand over her stomach, his hand over hers. Outside, the dome remained still. But within it, something had already changed. A new rhythm, a new presence, a life beginning, not in defiance of death, but in answer to it. The war hadn't taken everything. The past hadn't buried all futures. And now, nestled beneath layers of silence, trauma, and healing, something impossibly tender was growing. Something that would change everything. Chapter 8, The First Cry. The days had blurred, not in haste, but in quiet rhythm. Every morning came slower. Every night arrived earlier. The cold of Purion, 3 pressed closer to the dome walls now, but inside, the warmth was constant, not just from thermal regulators or cooking coils, but from breath, skin, movement. Siri moved differently, with gravity. Her gait had changed weeks ago, her balance subtly realigned around the life blooming inside her. She no longer reached for Glenn in passing. Now she leaned into him, and he leaned back, steadying her without words. They had made the dome ready. Not much could be done. It wasn't a habitat designed for birth. But Glenn had reinforced the hygiene module and cleared an entire section of the archive wing to serve as a makeshift delivery room. He scavenged every piece of medical programming from the old station's databanks and rewrote what the system didn't understand about Jalari physiology. Some guesses were guided by logic, others by instinct. Siri began waking in the middle of the night. Not from pain, from pressure, from breathlessness, from a tightening around her spine that grew sharper by the hour. Glenn never slept deeply anymore. He stirred with her each time, hand already on her back before she could ask. One morning, if it could be called morning, under a sunless sky, she sat on the edge of their shared bed, both hands resting against the swell of her belly. Her eyes were shadowed, her hair tangled from another sleepless stretch. Glenn knelt in front of her and rested his head gently against her legs. "It's today," she said. He nodded. "I know." She reached for him then, sliding her fingers into his hair, drawing his face upward. "Don't leave me." Not for a second. Labor came on slow, then all at once. The dome grew too small too quickly. The rooms became hot. Her breath came shorter. And when the waves of pressure seized her lower back, she gritted her teeth and held to the edge of the med bench like it could anchor her through a quake. Glenn stood beside her the entire time. He counted seconds. He whispered her name again and again, not to calm her, but to keep her tethered to the present. To remind her that here, in this sealed and forgotten corner of space, she was not alone. "Pressure's building," she said through gritted teeth. "The rhythm's changing." "You're almost there," he murmured, brushing her damp hair back with one hand. "You're doing so well." Siri bent forward, teeth bared, eyes burning. Her skin flushed violet blue, a shade Glenn had never seen before, a pulse of color that bloomed beneath the surface like heat lightning. She cried out, long and raw, and her body shifted with instinct she didn't have to think through. "I can feel the crown," she gasped. "It's close." Glenn wiped the sweat from her brow, then moved to support her from behind. "Lean back against me. Let it happen. I've got you." She did. Her spine pressed to his chest, his arms under her arms, holding her as the next contraction tore through her. Her hands gripped his forearms, her fingers digging in with unspoken desperation. Not fear, endurance. Another cry escaped her, this one sharper, edged with something that wasn't pain anymore. "It's here," she choked out. "Now." Glenn adjusted quickly, lowering her just enough to help bear down. The med assistant interface blinked red, then green. Alarms muted. It didn't matter. She didn't need their machines. One more push, and the dome was filled with a sound that had never been recorded on Purion. 3 before. A baby's cry. Sharp. Loud. Impossible. Siri collapsed forward with a choked gasp, and Glenn cradled the child with trembling hands. He'd never held something so small, so fragile. His throat closed around a prayer he hadn't meant to say aloud. The child was dusky blue, limbs curled tight, faint ridges of silver marking its back, traces of both her biology and his own. The eyes hadn't opened yet, but the mouth searched instinctively, demanding the world it had just entered. Glenn handed the child to her gently. Siri took her baby with a reverence so deep it seemed to radiate from her bones. Her arms enclosed around the infant. Her body curved protectively. A slow tear tracked down her cheek as she looked down in wonder. "I thought I'd never." Her voice broke. "But here they are. They're real. You did it," Glenn said softly, kneeling beside her. "You both did." They sat on a med bench for a long time, wrapped in silence and sweat and the scent of new life. Later, after the child had fed and fallen asleep against Siri's chest, she looked at Glenn, eyes still wide with disbelief. "They'll come back one day. The inspectors. The ones who said I didn't belong. Let them come," Glenn said. "They'll find something they didn't account for." "What's that?" He smiled, tired but fierce. "A future." She leaned against him, cradling their child. "We need a name. We will." When they opened their eyes, the dome's lights dimmed in cycles, mimicking sunrise. But it was unnecessary now. Inside that quiet, forgotten structure buried in ice and silence, something had awakened that no machine could replicate. No system could erase. A family, born not from conquest or design, but from survival, love, and the impossible choice to keep going when everything said to stop. The archive would remember battles. But this would live in the breath and blood of what came after. A new lineage, a new word. Home. The end.